Walk away while you can, a broke single dad faced down 6 thugs with nothing but his voice, and when his chilling past as an underground fighter exploded into the open, the whole town realized the most dangerous man in the room wasn't holding a weapon. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Daniel Cole worked methodically on the weathered fence outside Jenny's cafe. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision, replacing rotted boards and tightening loose screws. The early autumn air carried the sweet scent of fresh-baked pastries from the cafe's kitchen, mingling with the earthy smell of wood shavings at his feet. Daniel paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, his weathered face showing the lines of years spent working under the sunday. Through the cafe window, he caught glimpses of his son Ethan clearing tables, the teenager's movements carrying a hint of reluctance that made Daniel's heart sink. "Morning, Mr. Cole," called Mrs. Peterson as she walked past with her grocery bags. Daniel managed a polite nod and a quiet morning before returning to his work. He'd gotten good at these brief exchanges over the years. Just enough to be neighborly, but not enough to invite questions about his past. The steady rhythm of his hammer against wood helped quiet his thoughts, but couldn't completely silence the worry that had been growing lately. Ethan was 15 now, the same age Daniel had been when he'd first stepped into that underground fighting ring. The memory made his stomach clench. "Dad?" Ethan's voice broke through his reverie. "Jenny's mom wants to know how much longer on the fence." Daniel looked up at his son, noting how Ethan wouldn't quite meet his eyes. There was a distance there that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. "Tell her I'll be done before the lunch rush," he replied, trying to keep his voice light. "How's your shift going?" Ethan shrugged, already turning away. "Fine, I guess. Whatever." Daniel watched him disappear back into the cafe, shoulders slumped beneath his apron. He remembered when Ethan used to pepper him with questions about his work, eager to learn how things fit together, how to fix what was broken. Now, every conversation felt like navigating a minefield. The morning wore on as Daniel continued his work. He could hear the usual breakfast crowd inside. Farmers stopping in for coffee, office workers grabbing pastries before heading to their jobs in the small downtown area. This was the life he'd chosen after leaving his old one behind. Simple, honest work, the kind that left you tired in your muscles instead of your soul. As he hammered the last board into place, Daniel allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The fence stood strong now, ready to weather whatever storms might come. If only relationships could be fixed as easily as broken wood. He gathered his tools, preparing to head inside to let Jenny know the job was finished. That's when he heard the first signs of trouble. Loud voices, the screech of chair legs against floor tiles, and a girl's frightened protest. Daniel entered the cafe quietly, taking in the scene before him. 6 young men, probably in their early 20s, had surrounded Jenny's teenage daughter Sarah near the counter. Their leather jackets and hostile postures spoke of trouble looking for a place to happen. "Come on, sweetheart," one of them was saying, leaning too close to Sarah's face. "What's wrong with having a little fun?" The cafe had gone silent. Other customers sat frozen at their tables, eyes down, pretending not to notice. Ethan stood by the kitchen door, his face a mixture of anger and uncertainty. Daniel set his toolbox down by the door, the soft thud drawing attention. His movements were unhurried as he straightened up, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a stillness that seemed to radiate through the room. "Walk away while you can," he said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The leader of the group turned, a sneer starting to form on his face, but it faltered when he met Daniel's steady gaze. Daniel didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Years of training had taught him how to stand, how to hold himself, how to let the mere suggestion of what he was capable of do the talking. His eyes, usually tired and gentle, now held something else, a shadow of the man he used to be, the one they called the Iron Fist. The young men's bravado wavered. They could sense it, even if they didn't understand it. The presence of someone who knew exactly what violence cost and could exact that price if necessary. "Whatever," the leader muttered, backing away from Sarah. "This place is lame anyway." They filed out, throwing insults over their shoulders to save face. But their hasty exit told the real story. The bell above Jenny's cafe door tinkled as the last of the troublemakers shuffled out. Inside, the previously tense atmosphere melted into a buzz of excited whispers. Sunlight streamed through the cafe's front windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air as patrons leaned across their tables, heads bent close together. "Did you see how they just backed down?" A woman in a floral dress whispered to her companion. "Never seen anything like it," her friend replied, stealing glances at Daniel as he picked up his worn toolbox from the floor. The cafe owner's daughter, Sarah, approached Daniel with trembling hands clutching a fresh cup of coffee. "Mr. Cole, Thank you. Please, this is on the house." Her voice quivered slightly, but her grateful smile was steady. Daniel accepted the cup with a slight nod, his weathered face maintaining its usual calm expression.
"Just doing what's right, Sarah."
Nothing more to it. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if embarrassed by the attention. At the counter, Ethan stood frozen, dish towel still in his hands, staring at his father with wide eyes. He'd always known his dad as the quiet handyman who fixed things around town, the man who helped old Mrs. Peterson with her leaky roof and never complained about working overtime. But this was different. The way those guys had just left. Daniel made his way to the counter where Ethan worked, his movements careful and measured. The whispers followed him like autumn leaves in a breeze. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice caught between excitement and confusion. How did you do that?" Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, buying time before meeting his son's eager gaze. "Sometimes, son, the right words can be stronger than any action." He placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't always need force to stand up for what's right." More customers filtered into the cafe, drawn by the rapidly spreading news of the confrontation. The lunch rush was starting early, and the small space filled with curious onlookers pretending to study their menus while stealing glances at Daniel. Jenny, the cafe owner, emerged from the kitchen, her round face flushed with concern and gratitude. "Daniel Cole, I don't know how to thank you. Those boys have been causing trouble up and down Main Street for weeks now." She wiped her hands on her apron, shaking her head. Nobody stood up to them like that. Daniel shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "It's nothing, Jenny. Really." He checked his watch, clearly eager to escape the growing attention. "Ethan, I'll finish up the fence and pick you up after your shift?" Ethan nodded, still watching his father with newfound fascination. As Daniel headed back outside, Ethan noticed how the other patrons tracked his father's movements, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. Throughout the afternoon, Ethan caught snippets of conversations as he bussed tables and took orders. Such a quiet man, never would have guessed. Something about the way he stood. Each comment added another layer to the mystery that was suddenly his father. Ethan found himself watching through the window as Daniel worked on the fence, trying to reconcile the gentle handyman with the man who had faced down 6 troublemakers without flinching. The afternoon sun was setting when Ethan's shift finally ended. He hung up his apron and joined his father outside. Daniel had just finished securing the last board of the fence, his tools already packed away neatly in his box. They walked side by side down Main Street, the evening air cooling around them. Ethan noticed how his father seemed more alert than usual, his eyes scanning their surroundings with subtle movements. "Dad?" Ethan ventured, breaking their comfortable silence. "What you did today, that was pretty amazing." Daniel's stride faltered slightly, but he kept walking. "Sometimes the right thing seems amazing, but it's just what needs to be done." He glanced at his son with a small smile. "I'm just glad you're safe." They passed the hardware store, its windows already dark for the evening. A man in a leather jacket was locking up the barber shop across the street. As they drew closer, the man looked up, keys dangling forgotten in his hand. His eyes widened as they fixed on Daniel, recognition flooding his face. "No way," he breathed, just loud enough to carry across the quiet street. "It can't be." Daniel's shoulders tensed. Without breaking stride, he placed a gentle hand on Ethan's back, quickening their pace. "Come on, son. Your homework won't do itself." Ethan glanced back at the stranger, who still stood rooted to the spot. Staring after them as if he'd seen a ghost, the man's expression sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It wasn't just recognition he saw there, but something closer to fear. They turned the corner onto Cedar Street, leaving the man and his unsettling gaze behind. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in his world, something deeper than just standing up to bullies in a cafe. His father's calm exterior seemed to ripple now, like still waters hiding unknown depths. The evening shadows stretched long before them as they walked home, each lost in their own thoughts. Unknown to Ethan, this ordinary day marked the beginning of extraordinary changes for both father and son. The evening sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as Daniel stirred a pot of spaghetti sauce. The familiar scent of garlic and herbs filled their modest home, but tonight the usual comfort of cooking couldn't ease the tension in his shoulders. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, homework spread out before him, though his textbook remained unopened. "Dad?" Ethan's voice carried a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "What really happened at the cafe today?" Daniel kept his eyes on the bubbling sauce, adding a pinch of salt. "Just some kids causing trouble. Nothing more to it. But the way they looked at you." Ethan pushed his textbook aside. "I've never seen anyone back down that fast. Even Jake's dad, and he's a police officer, couldn't get those guys to leave last week when they were hanging around the parking lot." The wooden spoon scraped against the bottom of the pot as Daniel stirred slower, more deliberately. "Sometimes people just need a firm reminder to do the right thing. Come on, Dad." Ethan's chair scraped against the linoleum as he stood up. "I saw their faces. They were scared of you. Like, really scared." Daniel turned off the burner and reached for 2 plates from the cabinet. His movements were measured, careful, like everything else he did. "I'm just an old handyman, son. Nothing scary about that." "You're not that old," Ethan protested, helping set the table. "And you're definitely not just a handyman. I saw how you stood there. It was like you knew exactly what you were doing." The pasta steamed as Daniel divided it between their plates. "I've learned that standing up for what's right doesn't always mean throwing punches. Sometimes it's about showing people there's a better way." They sat down to eat, but Ethan barely touched his food. His fork pushed the spaghetti around his plate as his mind worked through the day's events. "That guy on the street recognized you. I saw him staring." Daniel's hand paused midway to his mouth. A drop of sauce fell back to his plate. "This town's small. People know each other. But we've only lived here 3 years," Ethan pressed. "And that man looked at you like he couldn't believe his eyes." "Eat your dinner before it gets cold," Daniel deflected, his voice gentle but firm. Ethan stabbed at his pasta with more force than necessary. "You always do this. Whenever I ask about anything from before we moved here, you change the subject." "Because the past is the past," Daniel said quietly. "What matters is who we choose to be today." "But how can I know who to be if I don't even know who you are?" The words burst from Ethan with unexpected force, hanging heavy in the air between them. Daniel set his fork down and looked at his son. Really looked at him. Ethan had his mother's eyes, warm and searching, always trying to understand the world around him. The sight made Daniel's chest ache. "I'm your father," he said softly. "Everything I do, everything I've ever done has been to protect you and give you a better life than I had." "By keeping secrets?" Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "By teaching you that strength isn't about intimidation or violence." Daniel reached across the table, placing his weathered hand over his son's. "Those boys at the cafe today? They chose the path of intimidation. But there's always a better way." Ethan pulled his hand back slowly. "You sound like Pastor Mike." A small smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "Maybe Pastor Mike knows what he's talking about." They finished their meal in silence, the questions still hanging unspoken between them. After dinner, Ethan retreated to his room to finish his homework, leaving Daniel alone with the dishes and his thoughts. Hours later, when the house had grown quiet and dark, Daniel sat in his worn armchair by the window. The neighborhood was silent, except for the distant bark of Mrs. Henderson's dog and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. He lifted his right hand, studying it in the dim light from the street lamp outside. The scar across his knuckles was old but still visible, a pale line that told a story he'd spent years trying to forget. His thumb traced the raised tissue, and memories flooded back unbidden. The roar of underground crowds, the metallic taste of blood, the sound of bones breaking beneath his fists, the nickname that had followed him like a shadow, the Iron Fist. Daniel closed his eyes, but the memories kept coming. The night everything changed. His wife's tears when he'd come home broken and bloody one too many times. Her final words before the accident that took her away forever. "Choose love over anger, Daniel. For Ethan's sake." He'd walked away from that life, buried it so deep he thought it would never surface again. But today, in that cafe, he'd felt it stirring that old power, that dangerous certainty. Even without throwing a punch, he'd fallen back on the authority that came from years of violence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in the darkness. Daniel opened his eyes and looked down at his scarred hand again. "Not again," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. The words hung in the air like a prayer and a promise, not for his sake, but for Ethan's. His son deserved better than a legacy of violence, better than the weight of his father's past mistakes. The morning sun beat down on Daniel's shoulders as he pushed his weathered pickup truck into the hardware store's parking lot. His old Ford groaned to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled. He needed supplies to fix Mrs. Anderson's broken porch steps. Just another ordinary day of handyman work. The bell above the door chimed as Daniel stepped inside. Cool air washed over him, a welcome relief from the summer heat. The familiar smell of sawdust and metal filled his nose. He nodded at Jerry, the elderly clerk who'd run the place for 30 years. "Morning, Jerry," Daniel said quietly. "Morning, Daniel. Need anything special today? Just some deck screws and a new level." Mine's seen better days. As Daniel walked down the narrow aisle of tools, voices drifted from the lumber section. Two men were talking in low tones, but their words carried clearly in the quiet store. "I'm telling you, Mike, it's him. Same build, same way of standing, even that calm voice. It's gotta be the Iron Fist." Daniel's hand froze on a box of screws. His shoulders tensed. "No way," the other man whispered back. "That fighter disappeared 15 years ago after that scandal. Besides, the Iron Fist was ruthless. This guy's just a handyman. Look it up online. There are old photos. Same guy, I'm sure of it. My cousin used to bet on those underground fights. Said the Iron Fist never lost. Put 3 guys in the hospital." Daniel set the box down carefully, trying to steady his trembling fingers. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, too harsh. "What happened to him anyway?" Mike asked. "Story goes he walked away after some big controversy. Something about a fixed fight and dirty money. Never showed his face in the circuit again." Daniel grabbed what he needed and headed to the counter, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The men's voices dropped even lower when they noticed him. Jerry rang up the purchase, peering at Daniel over his reading glasses. "You okay there? Looking a bit pale?" "Fine," Daniel managed. "Just the heat." Back in his truck, Daniel sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel. The leather was warm under his palms, grounding him in the present. But memories flickered through his mind like an old film reel. The roar of underground crowds, the metallic taste of blood, the hollow victory of another fallen opponent. He drove home slowly, taking the long way through town. But everywhere he looked, he caught people staring, whispering. Outside the diner, a group of women huddled together, their eyes following his truck. Near the post office, 2 teenagers pointed as he passed. The town's gossip mill was grinding fast today. When he pulled into his driveway, a sleek silver car was parked out front. A woman in a crisp blazer stood on his porch, notebook in hand. His heart sank as he recognized Sarah Martinez from the local paper. "Mr. Cole," she called out as he stepped from his truck. "Or should I say, Mr. Iron Fist? I'd love a few minutes of your time." Daniel walked up the path slowly, each step measured. "I'm just here to fix my roof, ma'am. Is it true you were once the most feared fighter in the underground circuit?" She held up her phone, displaying an old photograph. Even from several feet away, Daniel recognized himself. Younger, harder, standing over a fallen opponent with his fists raised. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "So you admit it?" Sarah's pen scratched across her notepad. "Why did you disappear? Was it because of the allegations of match-fixing?" The front door creaked open behind them. Daniel's heart stopped as he saw Ethan standing there, his son's face pale with shock. "Dad," Ethan's voice cracked. "The Iron Fist?" The name hung in the air between them, heavy with 15 years of secrets. Daniel saw the confusion in his son's eyes. The hurt of discovering his father wasn't who he thought. Sarah turned toward Ethan, her reporter's instincts firing. "Ethan, did you know about your father's past?" "He's not doing interviews," Daniel said firmly, stepping between them. His voice carried that same quiet authority he'd used at the cafe, but now Ethan understood where it came from. "Please leave my property." Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The story's already out there, Mr. Cole. People are talking. Wouldn't you rather tell your side?" Daniel held the door open for Ethan, who walked inside without meeting his eyes.
There's nothing to tell. That man doesn't exist anymore.
He watched Sarah drive away, her tires crunching on the gravel. The afternoon sun was still bright, birds still singing in the maple tree out front. But Daniel felt the walls of his carefully built new life starting to crack, 15 years of peace crumbling under the weight of his past. Inside, Ethan stood in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall, pictures of fishing trips, school graduations, quiet moments between father and son, moments that now felt somehow tainted by what lay hidden behind them. The Iron Fist, Ethan repeated, the name strange on his tongue. Is that why those guys at the cafe backed down? Because they knew who you were? Daniel leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling every one of his 50-plus years. No, he said softly. They left because they saw who I am now. Just a father trying to protect people. Ethan burst through the front door, his backpack hitting the floor with a thud. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their modest living room, where Daniel sat in his old armchair, head bowed over a worn photo album. Is it true? Ethan's voice cracked. What they're saying about you being some fighter called the Iron Fist? Daniel closed the album slowly, his weathered hands trembling slightly. He looked up at his son, seeing the confusion and hurt in those young eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah, Ethan's mother. Sit down, son, Daniel said softly, gesturing to the couch across from him. I don't want to sit down. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. I want answers. That reporter knew things about you. Things I've never known. How could you keep this from me? Daniel rubbed his face, the stubble rough against his palms. The ceiling fan whirred above them, its gentle whoosh filling the tense silence. You're right, Daniel finally said. You deserve the truth. He straightened in his chair, his broad shoulders slumping slightly. Yes, I used to fight. Underground matches. Nothing legal or proper. For how long? Ethan demanded, still standing but swaying slightly, as if the weight of this revelation was pushing him down. Started when I was 19, Daniel replied, his voice heavy with memory. Your grandfather had just passed, leaving us with nothing but debts. Your Aunt Jenny was still in high school, and someone had to put food on the table. Ethan's anger wavered. But why fighting? Because it paid well, and I was good at it. Daniel's eyes grew distant. Too good, maybe. Started in small venues, basement fights, then bigger matches, bigger money. They called me the Iron Fist because... He trailed off, shaking his head. Because what? Ethan pressed. Because I never lost. The words came out barely above a whisper. 3 years undefeated. But each victory came with a price, son. The violence, the pain I caused others, it ate at my soul. Ethan slowly sank onto the couch, his legs giving way. What changed? A small smile touched Daniel's lips. I met your mother, Sarah. She saw right through me. Past the tough guy act, past the fighter's reputation. She showed me there was another way to live. Daniel reached for the photo album again, opening it to a page where a younger version of himself stood beside a beautiful woman with Ethan's warm brown eyes. They were both smiling, his arm around her waist. This was taken the day I quit, Daniel continued. Sarah was already pregnant with you. I'd just won a big match, biggest purse of my career. But that night, she found me crying in our bathroom, disgusted with what I'd done to my opponent. He swallowed hard. She held me and said, Daniel Cole, you're better than this. Our baby deserves better than this. Ethan stared at the photo, his fingers hovering over his mother's face. So you just stopped? Just like that? It wasn't easy, Daniel admitted. The promoters, the other fighters, they didn't want to let me go. But your mother gave me strength. We moved here, started fresh. I learned honest work, fixing things instead of breaking them. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Everything I've done since then has been to give you a different path, son. A better one. But you lied to me, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. All these years, I thought I knew you. I didn't lie, Daniel protested gently. I just didn't tell you everything. I was ashamed, Ethan. Ashamed of who I was, what I'd done. I wanted to protect you from that part of my life. Protect me? Ethan stood up suddenly, anger flashing in his eyes again. Or protect yourself. Do you know what it's like hearing about your own father from strangers? Having some reporter tell me my dad was some kind of underground fighting legend? Ethan, please. No. Ethan backed away, shaking his head. You don't get to decide what parts of yourself I get to know. I'm not a little kid anymore. Daniel rose from his chair, reaching out. Son, But Ethan was already moving, snatching his backpack from the floor. I need to think, he muttered, yanking the front door open. I need space. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching helplessly as his son stormed down the front path. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting Ethan's retreating figure in shadow. His heart ached with every step his son took away from him, knowing that the truth he'd tried so hard to bury had finally caught up with them both. The screen door creaked softly in the evening breeze, and Daniel remained there, one hand pressed against the doorframe, until Ethan's silhouette disappeared around the corner. The autumn sun hung low in the sky as Ethan trudged along the cracked sidewalk, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his backpack. School had ended hours ago, but he'd stayed in the library, avoiding home and the questions that churned in his mind about his father. Dried leaves crunched under his feet as he walked past the shuttered storefronts of Main Street. The usual after-school crowd had thinned, leaving the streets eerily quiet. His mind wandered back to the reporter's words earlier that day. The Iron Fist. The name felt foreign, impossible to connect to his quiet, hard-working father. A sharp whistle cut through his thoughts. Ahead, 6 figures emerged from an alley between the old barber shop and the drugstore. Ethan's stomach dropped as he recognized them. The same guys from the cafe incident. Well, look who it is, the tallest one called out, a nasty grin spreading across his face. The fighter's boy. Ethan's hands tightened around his backpack straps. He looked around, but the street was empty. The group spread out, forming a loose circle around him. Your old man thinks he's something special, another one sneered, stepping closer. Acting all high and mighty at the cafe. Leave me alone, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. He attempted to push past them, but rough hands shoved him back. What's wrong? Daddy didn't teach you how to fight? The tall one gave him another push, harder this time. Ethan stumbled, his backpack sliding off his shoulder. Maybe he's not as tough as his daddy, someone laughed. The Great Iron Fist. What a joke. They started shoving him between them like a ball in a cruel game. Ethan's face burned with humiliation and anger. He wanted to fight back, to prove he wasn't weak, but fear kept his fists at his sides. Hey! A familiar voice boomed down the street. Get away from my son! Daniel Cole's footsteps pounded against the pavement as he ran toward them. The circle broke apart as the thugs backed away, their cockiness faltering at the sight of Daniel's approaching figure. Even in his work clothes, covered in sawdust from a day of repairs, Daniel's presence commanded attention. His eyes, usually gentle, now blazed with a fury Ethan had never seen before. What's wrong, Iron Fist? The tall one called out, though he kept backing away. Afraid your boy might learn the family business. Daniel reached Ethan and pulled him close, positioning himself between his son and the group. His voice came out low and dangerous. You want to prove something? Come at me, but leave my boy out of it. The threat in his words hung heavy in the air. The thugs exchanged glances, their bravado crumbling under Daniel's steady gaze. After a tense moment, they skulked away, muttering curses under their breath. Once they were gone, Daniel's shoulders sagged. He turned to Ethan, his hands gentle as they checked for injuries. Are you hurt? Ethan pulled away, anger and embarrassment mixing in his chest. I'm fine, he muttered. I don't need your help. Pain flickered across Daniel's face, but he nodded. Let's go home, son. They walked in silence, the space between them feeling wider than ever. The setting sun painted their shadows long and dark against the pavement. When they reached their small house, Daniel paused at the door, his hand resting on the worn wood. I'm sorry, Ethan, he said quietly. I never wanted this for you. Inside, Ethan dropped his backpack by the stairs and headed straight for his room. But Daniel's voice stopped him. Wait, please. Ethan turned, watching as his father sank into his armchair, suddenly looking every bit his age. The afternoon light streaming through the window highlighted the gray in his hair, the worry lines etched deep around his eyes. I thought I could leave it all behind, Daniel said, his voice heavy with regret. I thought if I stayed quiet, worked hard, lived right. But the past doesn't stay buried, does it? He ran a hand over his face, And for the first time, Ethan noticed the small scars on his father's knuckles, the slight crook in his nose that never quite healed straight. "Those boys," Daniel continued, "they won't stop. Not now. They're young and stupid and trying to prove something." He looked up at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "But I won't let them hurt you. I won't let my past destroy your future." Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs, torn between the anger he'd been holding on to and the pain he saw in his father's face. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked finally. Daniel's hands clasped together, knuckles white. "Because I was ashamed. Because that life, it wasn't something to be proud of. It wasn't something I wanted you to know about." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Your mother, she helped me find a better way. When we had you, I promised her I'd never go back to that life." The mention of his mother made Ethan's throat tight. He remembered her only in fragments, the smell of her perfume, the sound of her laugh, the way she'd sing while making dinner. "But now," Daniel continued, "these thugs think they can get to me through you. They think targeting my son will prove something." His jaw clenched, and for a moment Ethan caught a glimpse of the fighter his father used to be. "I won't let that happen. I'll protect you no matter what it takes." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and determination. Outside, the last rays of sunlight faded, leaving them in the growing darkness of their living room, father and son standing on opposite sides of a past that refused to stay hidden. The wooden benches of the town hall creaked under the weight of concerned citizens. Evening light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Ethan Cole sat in the back row, his shoulders tense as he watched dozens of familiar faces turn to stare at his father. Daniel Cole stood near the wall, his work-worn hands clasped in front of him. His usual plain button-down shirt and faded jeans made him look like any other hard-working man in their small town, but now everyone saw him differently. Mayor Thompson, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, tapped his gavel. "Order, please. We're here to discuss the recent disturbance at Sarah's Cafe and its implications for our community." Mrs. Peterson, who ran the local flower shop, stood up first. Her flowery dress rustled as she smoothed it nervously. "I've known Daniel Cole for years. He's fixed my shop's window frames twice. Always honest, always fair-priced. What happened years ago shouldn't matter now." "Shouldn't matter?" Tom Bradley's voice boomed from 3 rows ahead. The hardware store owner's face was red with anger. "My nephew was at that cafe. What if those thugs had pulled weapons? Cole's presence here is like waving a red flag at a bull." Ethan's hands balled into fists. He wanted to stand up, to defend his father, but the words stuck in his throat. "I was there," Sarah, the cafe owner, spoke up. Her gentle voice carried authority. "Those young men were harassing my daughter." Mr. Cole handled it peacefully. There was no violence. "This time," someone muttered from the crowd. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady but quiet. "I understand your concerns, what you've heard about my past." He paused, swallowing hard. "Yes, I was called the Iron Fist. Yes, I fought in underground matches. But that was 20 years ago, before my wife died, before I promised to give my son a better life." The room fell silent. Ethan watched his father's face, seeing the pain etched in every line. "Better life?" Tom Bradley scoffed. "Those thugs are back in town because of you. They're targeting your own son now." Several people nodded in agreement. A woman Ethan recognized from church clutched her purse tighter. "I've changed," Daniel said softly. "I learned that violence only breeds more violence. That's why I walked away from that life." Pastor Mike stood up from his seat near the front. "I believe in second chances. Daniel has been nothing but a model citizen since moving here. He volunteers at our food bank, helps elderly neighbors with repairs. But his reputation," someone interrupted. "What about property values? What if more of his old friends show up?" Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "My dad is a good man." His voice cracked with emotion. "You all liked him fine last week. Nothing's changed except now you know he has a past. Don't we all?" Daniel's eyes met his son's, filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Mayor Thompson raised his hands for quiet. "Perhaps we should consider—" "I say we put it to a vote," Tom Bradley interrupted. "Should Cole be asked to leave town?" Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "That's not legal," Pastor Mike protested. "You can't force someone to—" "It would be a recommendation only," Bradley pressed. "A community statement." Daniel stepped forward again, his shoulders straight but his eyes sad. "There's no need for a vote. I understand your fears. 20 years ago, I would have met them with anger. Now," he looked at Ethan, then back at the crowd. "Now I know better. I won't run away, but I won't fight either. Judge me by who I am today, not who I was." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "The question remains," Mayor Thompson said carefully, "about the young men who've returned. They seem focused on causing trouble." "I'll handle it peacefully," Daniel assured him. "They're angry and young, just like I was once. Sometimes the hardest thing is to stand firm without raising a fist." The mayor nodded slowly. "Perhaps we should take some time to—" "Time?" Bradley interrupted again. "While those thugs terrorize our town? Cole, your peaceful approach already failed. They're targeting your boy." Ethan watched his father flinch at those words. The proud shoulders seemed to sag slightly. "I move we vote now," Bradley insisted. "Seconded," someone called out. Mayor Thompson looked uncomfortable, but raised his gavel. "Those in favor of recommending Daniel Cole leave town, raise your hands." Ethan held his breath. Hands began to rise. First Bradley's, then others. Not everyone, but enough. More than half. The mayor's gavel fell with a hollow sound. "The majority has spoken. Mr. Cole, while this is not binding, we hope you'll consider the community's wishes." Daniel nodded once, his face a mask of calm dignity. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. Ethan hurried after him, glaring at the townspeople who wouldn't meet his eyes. Pastor Mike called out, "Daniel, wait!" But Daniel kept walking, his head lowered now, shame evident in every step. Ethan fell into step beside him, wanting to speak but finding no words as they left the town hall in silence. The morning sun painted ribbons of gold across the still lake water. Daniel Cole pulled his old pickup truck into the gravel parking area, tires crunching softly beneath them. Next to him, Ethan sat rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The tension between them felt as thick as summer humidity. Daniel reached behind the seat and pulled out 2 worn fishing rods. "Beautiful morning for it," he said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan shrugged, but got out of the truck anyway. The teenager's shoulders remained stiff as he followed his father down the narrow dirt path to their usual fishing spot, a quiet inlet sheltered by overhanging willows. Daniel took his time setting up their gear, his weathered hands moving with practiced care as he attached fresh line and checked the reels. He could feel Ethan watching him, curiosity temporarily overcoming his anger. "Here," Daniel said, holding out Ethan's rod. "Remember how I taught you to tie the knot?" "Yeah, I remember." Ethan's voice was flat, but he took the rod and began working with the line. His fingers fumbled slightly. "Take your time," Daniel said gently. "No rush. The fish aren't going anywhere." Ethan's hands stilled for a moment. Then, more carefully, he started over. This time, the knot came together perfectly. They cast their lines into the calm water. The red and white bobbers created gentle ripples as they settled. Birds called in the distance. Daniel breathed in deeply, letting the peace of the morning wash over him. "You know," he said after a while, "fishing isn't really about catching fish." Ethan gave him a sideways look. "What's it about then?" "Patience, faith." Daniel adjusted his grip on the rod. "You cast your line out there, and you have to trust that eventually something will happen. But you can't force it. You have to wait." "Like you waited?" Ethan's voice had an edge to it. "Is that what all that fighting was about?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the bobber drift. "No," he said finally. "Fighting was the opposite. It was about trying to force things, trying to prove something." He shook his head. "It never brought me peace." A small tug pulled at Ethan's line. "Dad," he said, excitement momentarily overtaking his brooding. "Easy now," Daniel coached. "Don't jerk the rod. Let it run a bit, then start reeling slowly." Ethan followed his father's instructions, his face screwed up in concentration. The fish fought hard, but Ethan kept the pressure steady. Finally, a decent-sized bass broke the surface, splashing and gleaming in the morning light. Daniel helped him land it, showing him how to remove the hook carefully. "See how you didn't try to muscle it in? Sometimes the harder path isn't the better one." Ethan held the fish, feeling its strength as it twisted in his hands. After a moment, he lowered it back into the water and watched it dart away. They rebaited their hooks and cast again. This time, the silence between them felt lighter. "I used to come here with your mother," Daniel said softly. "She loved these quiet mornings, said it was where she felt closest to God." Ethan looked at his father in surprise. Daniel rarely spoke about Mom. "She's the one who taught me about real strength," Daniel continued. "Not the kind that comes from fists, but the kind that comes from here." He touched his chest. "The kind that lets you walk away from a fight. The kind that helps you protect others without hurting anyone." "But those guys at the cafe," Ethan said. "You scared them. They left because they were afraid of you." Daniel nodded slowly. "They left because they saw something in my eyes, something dark from my past. But that's not the kind of respect I want you to earn, son. Fear isn't respect. Real respect comes from how you treat people, how you handle yourself when things get tough." A fish jumped nearby, creating rings of ripples across the water's surface. They watched them spread and fade. "I'm not ashamed of you, Dad," Ethan said suddenly, his voice quiet. I don't understand why you never told me." "Because I was ashamed of myself," Daniel replied honestly. "I wanted you to be better than I was, to learn from my mistakes instead of having to make your own." Ethan reeled in his lines slowly, thinking, "Mom knew about the fighting?" "She did. She's the one who helped me leave that life behind." Daniel smiled sadly. "She saw something in me I couldn't see in myself back then, something worth saving." The morning wore on. They caught a few more fish, releasing each one back into the lake. Daniel showed Ethan how to read the water, how to spot the places where fish might be hiding. But more importantly, they talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like forever. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel began packing up their gear. Ethan helped, handling the rods with new care and attention. "Dad," he said as they stowed the last of the tackle. "Thanks for bringing me here, for telling me about Mom." Daniel squeezed his son's shoulder, his heart full. For a moment, everything felt right with the world. Then movement caught his eye across the lake. 6 figures stood at the opposite shore, their postures unmistakable even at this distance. The leader raised his hand in a mock wave, and Daniel could almost see the smirk on his face. Ethan saw them too, his body tensed, but Daniel kept his hand steady on his son's shoulder. The thugs stood there, watching, making their presence known. The morning's peace shattered like glass, leaving behind the sharp edges of reality. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe's wide windows, casting long shadows across the packed room. Every chair was filled, and people lined the walls, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The usual smell of coffee and fresh-baked cookies couldn't mask the tension in the air. Daniel Cole stood at the front, his weathered hands gripping the back of a wooden chair. His shoulders, usually straight and strong, seemed to carry an invisible weight. Ethan sat in the front row, watching his father intently. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah Matthews, the cafe owner, said. Her kind eyes met Daniel's. "Mr. Cole has something he'd like to share with us, especially our young people." Daniel cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces. These were his neighbors, people who trusted him to fix their fences, repair their roofs, and watch their children. Now they looked at him differently, like he was both more and less than the man they'd known. "I've been running from my past for so long," Daniel began, his voice low but steady. "Some of you have heard rumors about who I used to be. They're true." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was known as the Iron Fist in underground fighting circles." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Near the back, the 6 young men who'd caused trouble earlier sat with crossed arms and smirks on their faces. "But what you don't hear in those stories," Daniel continued, "is the cost. Every victory came with a price." He lifted his right hand, showing the twisted knuckles. "These bones were broken and reset so many times. Sometimes I can barely grip a hammer now." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long scar. "This? From a fight in Cincinnati. The other guy had a knife. I got lucky. He didn't hit any arteries." Daniel's voice grew hoarse. "But that's not the worst of it." The room fell silent. Even the usual clink of coffee cups stopped. "The worst part was coming home to my wife, trying to explain why I couldn't pick up our baby boy because my ribs were cracked. The shame in her eyes when I'd lie about where the money came from. Daniel looked at Ethan, his eyes glistening. The worst part was teaching my son that violence solved problems, even when I never said those words out loud. Actions speak louder than words, don't they? Several parents nodded, pulling their children closer. I won most of my fights, Daniel admitted. But I lost something more important with each victory. My self-respect, my peace of mind, my soul. He rubbed his face with trembling hands. When my wife got sick, all that money, all those wins meant nothing. I couldn't fight the cancer that took her from us. Ethan's eyes widened. His father had never spoken about Mom's death so openly before. After she passed, I promised her, and myself, that I'd be better, that I'd show our boy a different way. Daniel's voice strengthened. That's why I'm standing here now. Not because I'm proud of who I was, but because I don't want any of you young people thinking that violence makes you strong. He turned to face the group of troublemakers directly. Real strength? It's getting up every morning and choosing to be kind when the world isn't kind to you. It's working honest jobs that don't pay much but let you sleep at night. It's admitting when you're wrong and trying to make it right. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with the napkin. Several other people did the same. I see some of you looking at me with fear, others with respect, Daniel continued. But both reactions miss the point. I'm not standing here as the Iron Fist. I'm here as a father who learned his lessons the hard way, who carries scars that will never heal, and who hopes you'll be smarter than I was. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. This is from my last fight. I won, but look at my eyes. He passed it to the front row. That's not triumph you see there. That's emptiness. That's a man who's lost his way. The photo made its way through the crowd. When it reached the troublemakers in the back, their leader glanced at it and snorted. You might think I'm soft now, Daniel acknowledged, meeting their dismissive looks. Maybe I am, but I'll tell you this. It takes more courage to walk away from a fight than to start one. It takes more strength to forgive than to seek revenge. And it takes more character to admit your mistakes than to pretend you're perfect. A few people started clapping, but harsh laughter from the back cut through the applause. The 6 young men stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. Nice story, old man, their leader called out, voice dripping with sarcasm. Real touching. They pushed their way toward the door, shoulders squared aggressively. Ethan watched them go, his hands clenched into fists under the table. When he looked back at his father, Daniel's face showed neither anger nor fear, just a deep, tired sadness. Their eyes met across the room, and Ethan felt caught between two worlds, the path of violence his father had left behind, and the harder road of peace he now walked. The door slammed behind the departing troublemakers, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Some people were still wiping tears from their eyes, while others looked uncomfortable, as if unsure whether to applaud or remain quiet. Daniel simply stood there, his confession complete, looking both stronger and more vulnerable than Ethan had ever seen him. The kitchen was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft clink of dishes as Daniel washed up after dinner. His hands, rough from years of manual labor, moved methodically through the warm, soapy water. The evening light filtered through the window above the sink, painting everything in soft, golden hues. Behind him, Ethan's footsteps shuffled across the worn linoleum floor. Daniel didn't turn around, giving his son the space he seemed to need. After the community meeting at the cafe, they'd driven home in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Dad, Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel placed the last plate in the drying rack and dried his hands on a dish towel. Yeah, son? I'm sorry. The words tumbled out quickly, like they'd been held back too long. For doubting you, for getting angry when I found out about, you know. Daniel turned around slowly. Ethan stood there in his favorite faded blue t-shirt, looking younger than his teenage years. His dark eyes, so much like his mother's, held a mixture of shame and hope. Come here, Daniel said softly, opening his arms. Ethan stepped forward, and Daniel pulled him into a tight hug. He could feel his son trembling slightly, and it reminded him of when Ethan was little and would come to him after a nightmare. You had every right to be upset, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have told you sooner, about everything. They moved to the living room, settling onto the old couch that had been through so many conversations over the years. The springs creaked as they sat, a familiar sound that somehow made the moment feel safer. "What you said at the cafe today." Ethan started, then paused. "I've never heard you talk like that before." Daniel nodded slowly. It was time for the truth to come out. All of it. The part about the broken bones and the nightmares, was that all real? Every word. Daniel rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long scar that ran from his elbow to his wrist. "This one's from my third underground fight. The guy had a knife hidden in his boot, didn't find out until it was too late." Ethan's fingers traced the scar lightly. "Did it hurt?" "Not as much as knowing I was becoming someone I didn't want to be." Daniel pulled his sleeve back down. "The physical pain heals, son. It's the other kind that sticks with you." The evening shadows lengthened across the room as they talked. Daniel shared stories he'd never told before about the desperation that drove him into fighting, about the shame that followed him home after each match, about meeting Ethan's mother and how her love had shown him a different path. "When your mom got sick," Daniel's voice grew softer, "she made me promise to be better, to show you a different way." He looked directly into his son's eyes. "I'm not proud of who I was back then, Ethan, but I'll never stop fighting for you. The right way this time, with love, with faith, with everything good your mother taught me." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. "I wish I could have known her better. She's in you, son. Every time you show kindness to someone, every time you choose what's right over what's easy, that's her shining through." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The weight of secrets finally lifted between them. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Can we pray together?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Like we used to when I was little." Daniel's heart swelled. "Of course we can." They moved from the couch to kneel beside Ethan's bed, just like they had done every night when Ethan was young. The familiar position brought back memories of bedtime stories and childhood prayers. Daniel reached for his son's hand, and they bowed their heads together. "Dear Lord," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "thank you for this moment of healing between father and son. Thank you for second chances and for the strength to face our past with honesty. Help us to be brave," Ethan added softly. "Not with fists, but with faith. Guide us to be the men you created us to be," Daniel continued, squeezing his son's hand. "Help me to be the father Ethan needs, and help him to grow in wisdom and grace. And please watch over Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice catching slightly. "Keep him safe." "Amen," they said together. As they rose from their knees, Daniel pulled Ethan into another embrace. The streetlight outside cast a warm glow through the bedroom window, and somewhere in the distance, a car engine idled in the darkness. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Daniel Cole walked home from Murray's grocery. The brown paper bags crinkled in his arms, loaded with the week's essentials: bread, milk, and Ethan's favorite cereal. His shoulders ached from a long day of repair work, but a small smile played on his lips as he thought about the quiet dinner he'd share with his son. The familiar route home took him past Pete's Hardware and the old bank building. Usually, he'd cut through Morgan Alley to save time, and today was no different. The narrow passage between buildings offered a shortcut he'd used hundreds of times before. Daniel shifted the grocery bags in his arms as he turned into the alley. The temperature dropped several degrees in the shade, and the sounds of Main Street grew muffled. His footsteps echoed off the brick walls, accompanied by the rustle of paper bags. A sudden scraping sound behind him made him pause. Before he could turn, someone kicked an empty trash can, the metallic clang reverberating through the alley. Daniel's muscles tensed, recognizing the deliberate noise for what it was: a warning. "Well, look who it is," a young voice sneered. "The famous Iron Fist." Daniel slowly turned to face the voice. The 6 young men from the cafe stood blocking the way he'd come. Their leader, a tall guy with a leather jacket, stepped forward with a cocky grin. "Seems like you're not so tough without an audience," another one taunted. Daniel carefully set his grocery bags down against the wall. "Boys," he said calmly, "you don't want to do this." "Oh, but we do." The leader cracked his knuckles. "You made us look weak. That doesn't sit well with us." "Looking weak isn't your problem," Daniel said softly. "It's thinking that violence makes you strong." He held his hands up, palms open. "I've been where you are. Fighting doesn't solve anything. It just creates more pain." A couple of the young men exchanged uncertain glances, But their leader's face hardened. "Shut up with your preaching, old man." They moved to surround him. Daniel kept his hands raised, his voice steady. "I'm not going to fight you, but it's not too late to walk away." "Yeah?" The leader stepped closer. "Then this'll be easy." The first punch came fast, a wild swing that Daniel could have blocked easily. Instead, he took the hit, staggering back against the brick wall. The impact split his lip, and he tasted blood. "Not so tough now, huh?" Another fist struck his ribs. Daniel grimaced, but didn't raise his hands to defend himself. "Why aren't you fighting back?" one of them demanded, confusion mixing with anger. Daniel met the young man's eyes. "Because someone has to break the cycle," he said through bloodied lips. "Violence only breeds more violence." His words seemed to enrage them further. Blows rained down on him from multiple directions. Daniel's legs buckled, and he slid down the wall. He curled up, protecting his vital organs as kicks found his back and sides. Through the pain, he heard their angry shouts become uncertain. His groceries lay scattered across the alley floor, bread crushed, milk cartons split open. The sight seemed to give some of them pause. "This isn't right," one of the younger ones said, backing away. "He's not even fighting back." "Shut up!" their leader snapped, but his voice wavered. "He deserves this." Daniel coughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. "No one deserves this," he managed to say. "Not you, not me." The beating continued, but with less intensity. Two more of the young men backed away, leaving only the leader and his closest friends. Daniel's vision blurred, but he kept his eyes open, meeting their gaze whenever he could. Finally, the leader stepped back, breathing hard. "Let's go," he ordered, his voice shaky. "He's had enough." They retreated down the alley, leaving Daniel slumped against the wall. He waited until their footsteps faded before trying to move. Every breath sent sharp pains through his ribs. His face felt swollen, and his left eye was already beginning to close. With tremendous effort, Daniel pushed himself to his feet, using the wall for support. He gathered what he could of the scattered groceries, though most were ruined. The walk home, usually 10 minutes, took him nearly an hour. Each step was agony, but he forced himself to keep moving, thinking of Ethan. The sun had set by the time he reached their small house. The porch light was on, waiting for him. Daniel made it up the 3 steps before his strength finally gave out. He collapsed against the front door, the remaining grocery bag falling from his trembling hands. Through the door, he heard Ethan's footsteps approaching. The sound of his son's voice calling, "Dad?" was the last thing he heard before darkness took him. "Dad!" Ethan's scream pierced the quiet neighborhood. "Oh God, Dad! Somebody help, please! Somebody help us!" The afternoon light filtered weakly through the bedroom curtains, casting a pale glow on Daniel's bruised face. He lay in bed, chest rising and falling with labored breaths beneath the white bandages. The doctor had patched him up hours ago, muttering about cracked ribs and severe bruising. But the deepest wounds weren't the ones wrapped in gauze. Beside the bed, Ethan sat in his father's old armchair, his hands clenched into tight fists. The boy's eyes burned with an intensity that reminded Daniel too much of himself at that age, that dangerous fire that had led him down paths he'd spent years trying to forget. "They can't get away with this," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "They're probably laughing right now, thinking they won." Daniel tried to shift position, wincing at the sharp pain in his side. "Son, don't, Dad. Don't tell me to let it go." Ethan stood up, pacing the small bedroom like a caged animal. "I saw what they did to you. Your face, your ribs. You could barely make it to the door." His voice cracked. "I had to carry you inside." The shame of that memory hit Daniel harder than any punch. He'd never wanted his son to see him like that, broken, helpless, the mighty iron fist reduced to a bloody mess on his own doorstep. But what hurt most was seeing the rage building in Ethan's eyes, knowing exactly where that path led. "I know where they hang out," Ethan continued, his words coming faster now. "Behind the old warehouse. Tommy from school told me. They're there most nights, drinking, acting tough." He stopped pacing, his back to Daniel. You could, what?" Daniel's voice was quiet but firm, despite the pain. "Jump 6 guys by yourself? Get yourself hurt? Or worse?" Ethan spun around. "I'm stronger than you think, and they deserve justice, Not vengeance, Daniel interrupted. There's a difference, son. What's the difference when they're out there free while you're lying here? Ethan's voice rose. When everyone in town is whispering about us, laughing at us, his eyes glistened. When I had to watch my own father crawl home beaten? Daniel closed his eyes, memories washing over him. Nights of violence, the taste of blood, the roar of underground crowds. Every victory had felt like justice back then. Every broken nose and shattered jaw had seemed deserved. But violence only bred more violence, an endless cycle he'd barely escaped. Come here, Daniel said softly, patting the edge of the bed. Ethan hesitated, then sat down carefully, avoiding his father's injuries. Up close, Daniel could see the dark circles under his son's eyes. The boy hadn't slept since the attack. I need to tell you something, Daniel began, his voice rough. Something I've never told anyone. He took a painful breath. The last fight I had, before I quit, it wasn't just about your mother getting sick. There was this young guy, couldn't have been more than 20. He'd been talking big, challenging everyone. Daniel paused, the memory still sharp after all these years. I destroyed him, Ethan. Not just beat him, I broke him. His jaw, his ribs, his spirit. The crowd loved it. They called me a hero. He met his son's eyes. 2 weeks later, I heard he'd taken his own life. Couldn't live with the shame, they said. Ethan's anger faltered, replaced by something uncertain. Dad, that's what violence does, son. It doesn't just hurt bodies, it poisons souls. Those men who attacked me, they're already poisoned. But you. Daniel reached out, touching Ethan's arm. You're better than that. Better than I was. But they hurt you, Ethan whispered, his voice small now. How can I just let that go? Because letting go takes more strength than holding on. Daniel tightened his grip on Ethan's arm. Don't fight darkness with darkness. Promise me. Ethan stared at his father's bandaged face, at the gentle eyes that had seen too much violence, at the hands that had dealt so much pain but now only wanted to protect. His jaw clenched, and he pulled away without answering. Daniel watched his son stand up, saw the war raging behind those young eyes, the same war he'd fought in his own heart decades ago, the choice between vengeance and mercy, between being the man the world expected and the man he could become. Ethan walked to the window, his silhouette dark against the fading light. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and uncertain promises. The morning sun crept through Ethan's bedroom window, but he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red and puffy from a night spent crying and raging. The image of his father, broken and bleeding on their doorstep, kept replaying in his mind like a horrible movie he couldn't turn off. He sat up in bed, his muscles tense with anger. The baseball bat leaned against his closet door where he'd placed it the night before. It was his old Little League bat, the one his dad had bought him when he was 12. Now it felt heavy with different possibilities. Ethan grabbed the bat and gripped it hard, his knuckles turning white. The thugs would probably be hanging out behind the gas station like they usually did. It would be easy. Too easy. Don't fight darkness with darkness. His father's weak whisper from last night echoed in his head. Ethan's grip on the bat loosened slightly. He walked to his window and looked out at their small front yard. The flower beds his father had planted last spring were starting to bloom. Purple petunias and yellow daffodils reaching toward the Sunday. Daniel had spent hours on his knees in the dirt, teaching Ethan about patience and nurturing things to grow. Sometimes the hardest thing, Daniel had said while carefully placing each seedling, is waiting for something beautiful to emerge from the mud. Ethan's eyes burned with fresh tears. He looked down at the bat in his hands and suddenly felt ashamed. This wasn't what his father had taught him. This wasn't what his father had suffered for. He set the bat down and sat on his bed, head in his hands. The anger was still there, but something else was growing alongside it. Understanding. His father hadn't just been teaching him about gardening that day. He'd been showing him a better way to live. Ethan got dressed quickly and went to check on his father. Daniel was asleep, his face still swollen but peaceful. The morning light softened the worst of his bruises. On the nightstand lay his father's worn Bible, open to a passage about forgiveness. Ethan touched the page gently, remembering all the times he'd seen his father reading it in the early morning hours. Mrs. Martinez from next door had left a pot of soup in their kitchen. The note attached read, "For our protector and his brave son." Ethan warmed up a bowl for his father and left it covered on the bedside table. Then he headed out, walking with purpose toward Main Street. The morning air was crisp, and the town was just beginning to wake up. Shop owners were unlocking their doors, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. Everything looked normal, but Ethan knew better. The town was hurting, not just from the violence, but from the fear and division it had created. As he walked, memories of his father's words at the cafe came flooding back. How Daniel had spoken about the true cost of violence, about broken dreams and wasted years. His father hadn't just been telling his story, he'd been trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes. The cafe was already open when Ethan arrived. Sarah, the owner's daughter who had been harassed that first day, was wiping down tables. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed, relief visible on her face when she saw it was Ethan. "How's your dad?" she asked softly, setting down her cloth. "Resting," Ethan replied. "Is your mom here? I need to talk to her." Sarah disappeared into the kitchen and returned with Mrs. Chen, the cafe owner. Her usual cheerful expression was replaced with concern when she saw Ethan. "My boy, we've all been so worried," Mrs. Chen said, pulling out a chair. "Sit, please. I'll get you some hot chocolate." "No, thank you, Mrs. Chen," Ethan said, remaining standing. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. "I actually came because I have an idea, something that might help heal our town." Mrs. Chen's eyes softened. She pulled out a chair for herself and gestured for Ethan to continue. "My dad tried to show those guys a better way," Ethan began, his voice growing stronger. "He tried to reach them with words instead of fists. Maybe they didn't listen then. But what if we gave everyone another chance to hear that message?" He explained his idea. A town gathering right there in the cafe, not to point fingers or assign blame, but to bring people together, to share stories, to understand each other, to find a way forward that didn't involve violence. "We could invite everyone," Ethan continued, his words coming faster now. "The council members who supported Dad, the ones who didn't, the people who were scared, the people who were angry, even," he took a deep breath, "even those guys who hurt my father." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. "Ethan, are you sure? After what they did?" Ethan nodded, though his hands were trembling slightly. "That's exactly why. Dad always says that the hardest choices are usually the right ones. He chose not to fight back in that alley. Now it's my turn to make a choice." Sarah had stopped pretending to clean tables and was listening intently. "I think it's a good idea," she said quietly. "Better than waiting for more violence." Mrs. Chen was silent for a long moment, studying Ethan's face. Finally, she smiled. A real smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Your father raised you well, Ethan Cole." "Very well indeed." She stood up and straightened her apron. "Tell me more about what you have in mind." The morning bustle of Main Street paused as Ethan Cole taped another colorful flyer to the hardware store's window. "Community Peace Gathering, this Saturday at Sarah's Cafe," read the bold letters, with "Everyone Welcome" written underneath in warm, inviting script. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed out a wrinkle in the paper, but his jaw was set with determination. Behind him, Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop shuffled over, her arms full of fresh daisies. "Here, Ethan," she said, pressing them into his hands. "For the tables at the gathering. Your father helped fix my cooler last month, wouldn't take a penny for it. This is the least I can do." Ethan's throat tightened as he accepted the flowers. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. That means a lot." All around town, similar scenes played out. The baker promised fresh rolls. The Miller twins offered to set up chairs. Even gruff old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his porch, volunteered his famous lemonade recipe. It wasn't just charity. Ethan could see it in their eyes. They were choosing sides, not between violence and peace, but between fear and hope. Back home, Daniel sat in his favorite armchair, wincing as he shifted position. His bruises had faded from angry purple to sickly yellow, but the pain still lingered. He watched through the window as Ethan coordinated with volunteers in their front yard, directing where to store donated supplies for the gathering. "You need anything, Dad?" Ethan asked, popping his head in during a break. Daniel's eyes were moist with pride. "Just watching you work, son. You've got your mother's heart, you know that?" Ethan paused, touched by the rare mention of his mom. I learned from you too, Dad. All those times you chose not to fight back, I get it now. Sarah, the cafe owner, became Ethan's strongest ally. She closed early each day to help with preparations, teaching him how to organize seating charts and calculate food quantities. Your father stood up for my Katie, she said while showing him how to arrange tables. Now it's our turn to stand up for what's right. The whole town seemed to wake up. People who'd crossed the street to avoid Daniel now stopped to ask about his recovery. Children who'd been warned to stay away from the fighter's son now helped Ethan put up streamers and banners. One afternoon, as Daniel slowly made his way down the porch steps with his cane, a group of elderly ladies from the church approached. They carried casseroles and get-well cards, but more importantly, they carried stories. Your father helped my grandson quit drinking, one confided to Ethan. Never preached, just talked to him man to man. He fixed my roof last winter, another added. Wouldn't leave until he was sure it wouldn't leak. Each story revealed a different side of Daniel, not the feared fighter, but the quiet helper, the secret guardian of their community. Ethan felt his chest swell with a new kind of pride. The day before the gathering, Ethan found his father attempting to help arrange chairs in the backyard, where volunteers were organizing supplies. Dad, you should be resting, Ethan protested, rushing to take the chair from him. Daniel gripped his cane but stood straight. Can't let you carry everything alone, son. You've carried enough, Ethan replied softly. It's my turn now. They stood together in the yard, watching the sunset paint the sky in peaceful colors. Community members came and went, dropping off food, chairs, and decorations. Each person who passed offered a kind word or a gentle pat on Daniel's shoulder. Never thought I'd see the day, Daniel murmured, leaning heavily on his cane. All these years, I've been running from who I was, trying to protect you from my past, and here you are, turning it into something beautiful. Ethan paused from his work, really looking at his father. The lines on Daniel's face seemed softer now, less haunted. Despite his injuries, he stood taller, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. A small group of children ran past, helping to carry paper lanterns for the gathering. They waved at Daniel, no fear in their eyes, only warmth. One little girl stopped to hand him a drawing she'd made, a simple sketch of him fixing her mother's fence, labeled Our Hero in crayon. Daniel's hands shook as he accepted it, and Ethan pretended not to notice the tear that rolled down his father's cheek. As the evening wound down and the last of the volunteers headed home, father and son sat on their porch steps. The street was lined with lanterns and banners, transforming their ordinary neighborhood into something magical. I spent years fighting in rings, Daniel said quietly, thinking that's what made me strong. But this, he gestured at the transformed street, at the evidence of community coming together. This is real strength. Ethan reached over and squeezed his father's hand. We're going to make it right, Dad. All of it. Daniel turned to his son, his eyes filled with a pride so deep it made his voice shake. The late afternoon sun painted the cafe's windows in warm amber light. Inside, tables had been pushed together to create long rows where families sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing plates of homemade cookies and steaming cups of coffee. The usual clinking of cups and casual chatter had been replaced by something more purposeful, a community coming together. Daniel Cole sat in the front row, his bandaged hands resting on a wooden cane. His body still ached from the beating, but his heart swelled with pride as he watched Ethan move confidently among the gathered townspeople. The cafe owner, Mrs. Martinez, had outdone herself. The aroma of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air, and colorful paper chains, made by the local children, decorated the walls. "How you holding up, Daniel?" asked Tom Baker, the hardware store owner, settling into the chair beside him. His wife Sarah offered Daniel a gentle pat on the shoulder as she sat down too. "Better every day," Daniel replied, managing a small smile. The bruises on his face had faded to yellowish green, but the memory of that night in the alley still haunted him. At the front of the room, Ethan cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone they'd borrowed from the church. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice came out clear and strong. "Thank you all for coming today. This isn't just about my dad or what happened to him. It's about who we want to be as a community." Daniel watched as heads nodded throughout the room. Even those who had once whispered about his past were here, their faces open and attentive. Mrs. Martinez's daughter Maria stood up next. "I want to share something," she said softly. When those guys were harassing me that day, I was terrified. But Mr. Cole showed me that one person standing up with kindness can change everything. More people began to share. Old Mr. Wilson talked about forgiveness after losing his son to gang violence. Sarah Baker spoke about rebuilding trust when her store was vandalized last year. Each story wove together, creating a tapestry of hurt and healing. The local church choir, led by Mrs. Peterson, stood up to sing. Their voices filled the cafe with amazing grace, and Daniel noticed several people wiping away tears. He felt his own eyes growing moist as Ethan sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "You did good, son," Daniel whispered. "Real good." Ethan squeezed his father's hand. "I learned from the best, Dad." The singing continued, and more people shared stories. Little Jenny Thompson, only 8 years old, brought up a get well card she'd made for Daniel, covered in glitter and wobbly hearts. Others followed with small gifts, home-cooked meals, offers to help with yard work while he recovered, promises of prayers and support. "This is what community looks like," Ethan said when he took the microphone again. "Not fear or violence or revenge. This is real strength." Daniel struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. The room fell quiet as he made his way to stand beside his son. His voice was rough with emotion, but he spoke clearly. "For years, I tried to bury my past. I was ashamed of who I'd been, the fighter, the angry young man who solved everything with his fists. But my son..." He paused, looking at Ethan with pride. "My son showed me that the real fight isn't in our fists, it's in our hearts." The cafe door chimed. 6 figures stood in the doorway, their shadows stretching across the wooden floor. The young men who had attacked Daniel, led by their swaggering leader, filed into the cafe. Their usual smirks were firmly in place, but something uncertain flickered in their eyes as they took in the gathered crowd. The singing stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Parents pulled their children closer. The peaceful atmosphere crackled with sudden tension. Daniel felt Ethan stiffen beside him, but his son didn't move. They stood together, father and son, watching as the 6 young men made their way further into the room. A heavy silence fell over the cafe. The only sound was the gentle whirring of the ceiling fans and the distant tick of the old clock above the counter. The community that had been sharing stories of hope and redemption now held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The lead thug's eyes met Daniel's, then shifted to Ethan. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. The other 5 spread out behind him, their practiced intimidation stance at odds with the paper chains and children's artwork decorating the walls. No one moved, no one spoke. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight, waiting to either snap or be released. The cafe fell silent as Ethan stepped forward. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained steady. He looked at the 6 thugs standing in the doorway, their leather jackets and sneering faces a stark contrast to the warmth of the gathering inside. "We don't need more fists," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "We need a future." From his seat in the front row, Daniel watched his son with tears in his eyes. His bruises still ached, but pride swelled in his chest, stronger than any pain. Ethan gestured to the crowd around him. "Look at everyone here. We're not here for a fight. We're here because we believe in something better." He paused, gathering his courage. "My dad was known as the Iron Fist once. I never knew that growing up. I just knew him as the guy who fixed things around town, who taught me to fish, who prayed with me every night." The leader of the gang, a tall guy with a jagged scar above his eyebrow, crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "So what? Your old man was tough once. Now look at him." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, look at him. Those fights nearly destroyed him. Every victory cost him something. His health, his peace, his relationships." He turned to face his father. "Dad never told me about his past because he was ashamed of it. Not because he lost fights, but because he won them." Daniel bowed his head, wiping away tears with a trembling hand. Around him, the cafe customers listened intently, many nodding in understanding. "When you guys beat him up," Ethan continued, his voice cracking slightly, "I wanted revenge. I wanted to hurt you like you hurt him. But then I remembered something my dad always says. Fighting darkness with darkness just makes the world darker." The youngest of the thugs, barely older than Ethan, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between his friends and the floor. My dad could have fought back that night. Even injured, he probably could have hurt some of you pretty bad. But he chose not to. Ethan took another step forward. That's not weakness. That's real strength. The cafe owner's daughter, Sarah, stood up from her table. He's right. When you guys first came in here hassling me, Mr. Cole could have beaten you all up. Instead, he gave you a chance to walk away. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some of the older town residents shared knowing looks, remembering their own youthful mistakes and the people who had shown them mercy. I forgive you, Ethan said clearly, looking each of the thugs in the eye. Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger only hurts me more. My dad taught me that. The cafe fell silent again. The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air like a physical presence. The youngest thug's shoulders slumped, and he stared at his feet, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Even through his tough exterior, it was clear Ethan's words had reached something inside him. The gang's leader maintained his sneer, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first crack in his armor of anger. He didn't move from his spot by the door, his stance still confrontational, but he didn't leave either. Daniel slowly rose from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane. The bruises on his face stood out in stark contrast to his gentle smile as he looked at his son with profound pride. Ethan had found a strength greater than any his father had possessed in the fighting rings. The strength to break the cycle of violence with love and forgiveness. The air in the cafe crackled with possibility. In that moment, as the youngest thug's eyes remained fixed on the floor, and their leader's sneer wavered, the path forward hung in the balance. Not everyone would choose light over darkness, but sometimes one crack in the darkness was enough to let the light begin streaming in. Daniel pressed his hands against the arms of his chair, his muscles trembling with effort. Every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his still healing body. But he refused to stay seated. Not now, not when his son had shown such courage. Ethan noticed his father struggling and quickly moved to help him. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do, son. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. He gripped Ethan's shoulder, partly for support and partly in pride, as he faced the group of young men at the cafe entrance. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces. The leader, a tall guy with a worn leather jacket, stood with his arms crossed, trying to look tough. But Daniel saw something familiar in his eyes, the same desperate need to prove himself that he'd once carried in his own youth. You boys, Daniel began, his voice carrying across the now silent cafe. You remind me of myself at your age. He paused, steadying himself against Ethan. Full of anger, looking for respect in all the wrong places. The youngest thug shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. The others maintained their defensive postures, but Daniel could see the uncertainty in their expressions. When I was fighting underground, Daniel continued, I thought I was proving something, building something. He shook his head slowly, but I was just destroying myself piece by piece. Every victory left me more empty inside. The cafe owner, Sarah, stepped forward from behind the counter. Her daughter, who the thugs had harassed that first day, stood close behind her. Daniel nodded to them, then turned back to the young men. Sarah here needs help in the morning shift. Real work, honest work. Daniel's eyes met each of theirs in turn. It won't make you famous, won't give you the rush of a fight, but it'll let you walk down these streets with real pride, not the kind that comes from making others afraid. The leader's jaw clenched. You think we need your charity? His voice carried a sharp edge, but there was something beneath it, uncertainty, maybe even hope. It's not charity, Ethan spoke up, his voice strong and clear. It's a choice. The same choice Dad made years ago to be something better than what the world expected of him. Daniel felt a surge of pride so strong it almost overwhelmed the pain in his body. His son understood, really understood. You can walk away while you still can, Daniel said softly, echoing his words from that first confrontation. But this time, they carried a different weight. Not from a fight, from the path you're on. The path that ends in prison, or worse. The cafe was completely still. The other patrons, neighbors, friends, families watched in respectful silence. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow their spinning, as if holding their breath. I've got the early shift tomorrow, Sarah added, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. 6 a.m. Pay's not great at first, but it's steady. and there's always extra work for those willing to learn. The leader's tough expression wavered. His eyes darted between his friends, Daniel, and the door. His fingers played with the brim of his cap nervously. One of the others, a stocky kid with close-cropped hair, took a small step forward. What? What kind of work? His voice was barely above a whisper. Starting with basics, Sarah replied. Register, cleaning, prep work. But I need someone who can handle deliveries too. Maybe learn the grill. Another of the group, tall and lanky, shifted his weight. My uncle used to be a cook, he muttered, almost to himself. The tension in the room began to shift, like ice starting to thaw. Daniel could feel it the moment balanced on a knife's edge between violence and hope. The leader looked around, sensing he was losing control of his crew. His face twisted through several emotions: anger, fear, confusion. Finally, he yanked his cap off his head. For a moment he stood there, cap crumpled in his fist. Then, with a sudden motion, he threw it to the ground. Without a word, he turned and stalked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling harshly in his wake. The remaining 5 young men stayed rooted in place, looking lost without their leader. They glanced at each other, then at the door, then back at Daniel and Sarah. The youngest one swallowed hard. 6 a.m.? he asked tentatively. Sarah nodded, a small smile touching her lips. 6 a.m. sharp. The early morning sun painted the cafe windows in soft amber light. Inside, Daniel sat at his usual corner table, sipping coffee while watching 2 familiar faces sweep the floor. Jake and Matt, once part of the gang that had beaten him, now wore brown aprons with the cafe's logo. Their movements were careful, deliberate, as if trying to prove themselves worthy of this second chance. Daniel noticed how Jake paused to help an elderly woman with her heavy bag, and how Matt carefully arranged the chairs just the way Sarah, the owner's daughter, had shown them. Small gestures, but they spoke volumes about the change in these young men. His ribs still ached when he breathed too deeply, a reminder of that night in the alley. But the pain felt different now, less like a burden and more like a testament to the power of forgiveness. The bruises had faded to yellow-green shadows, healing just as the town's wounds were healing. Ethan emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. He moved with a quiet confidence that made Daniel's heart swell. Gone was the uncertain teenager who'd struggled with his father's past. In his place stood a young man who had learned that true strength lay in compassion. More coffee, Dad? Ethan asked, already tilting the pot. Thanks, son. Daniel watched as Ethan filled his cup with practiced ease. You're getting good at this. Sarah says I could manage the morning shift soon. Ethan's eyes sparkled with pride. Jake and Matt are helping me learn the ropes. As if on cue, Jake looked up from his sweeping and gave them a tentative nod. The gesture was small, but sincere. 3 months ago, such a peaceful scene would have seemed impossible. Later that afternoon, Daniel worked on the cafe's broken air conditioning unit. His toolbox lay open beside him, tools neatly arranged a stark contrast to the chaos that had once defined his life. Matt held the flashlight, eager to learn something new. See this part here? Daniel pointed to a component. It's like life sometimes. Gets stuck, makes noise, causes trouble. But with the right tools and patience, you can fix it. Matt nodded, understanding flowing deeper than just air conditioning repair. Like what you and Ethan did for us, Mr. Cole. Fix something broken. Daniel paused, touched by the simple truth in those words. We all need fixing sometimes, son. The trick is being willing to do the work. The day wound down like many others now, peaceful, purposeful. Daniel watched Ethan help close up shop, proud of how his son had turned a potential disaster into something beautiful. The other thugs hadn't returned, especially their leader, but that was okay. You couldn't save everyone. You could only open the door and hope they'd walk through it. That evening, as the sun began its descent, Daniel and Ethan sat on their porch steps. The wood was warm beneath them, still holding the day's heat. Their small front yard needed mowing, but the overgrown grass swayed prettily in the breeze, dotted with dandelions that Ethan had never gotten around to pulling. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky transform. Streaks of pink and orange painted the clouds, promising another beautiful day tomorrow. A gentle wind carried the scent of Mrs. Henderson's flowering jasmine from next door. Daniel's body had healed enough that he could sit without wincing, though he still moved carefully. But the physical recovery wasn't what occupied his thoughts. He was thinking about how much had changed, not just in the town or in those young men at the cafe, but in himself and his son. Ethan had grown in ways that went beyond physical height. There was a wisdom in his eyes now, a gentle strength that reminded Daniel of his late wife. She would have been so proud to see how their son had handled everything. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Daniel glanced at Ethan, noting how his son's profile had sharpened over the past months. Childhood softness giving way to the angles of approaching adulthood, but it was the peace in his expression that truly moved Daniel. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting warm pools of light along their quiet street. In the distance, a dog barked. And somewhere, a screen door creaked shut. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. The kind of evening they'd both learned to appreciate more deeply. Now, Daniel shifted slightly, his healing muscles still stiff from the day's work. He reached out and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling the solid strength there. The touch carried all the pride and love he felt for his son, for the man he was becoming. "I told them to walk away while they could," Daniel whispered, his voice carrying in the evening quiet. "Now you've shown them how." They sat together, father and son, watching as the sky brightened with the first hints of dawn. The new day's light seemed to promise something special not just for them, but for everyone who had been part of their story. It was a symbol of hope, of renewal, of the endless possibilities that come with choosing love over fear, forgiveness over revenge. The sun rose slowly, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, turning their simple porch into something magical. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was there in the silence between them, in the warm hand on a shoulder, in the shared view of a new day dawning. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Cole, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.